We are programmed to do anything to survive. And sometimes that's nothing at all. Welcome back to the Beth B Shift, where the vibe is unmuted, unafraid, and unapologetic. I'm Beth, and today I want to talk about something that changed the way I see people. And honestly, it kind of changed the way I see myself. We're all used to the phrase that we'll do anything to survive. And most times that may look like fighting or running or protecting yourself. But what if survival sometimes looks like doing nothing at all? And I want to put this little disclaimer out because in this episode, I'm going to use words that are probably a little, I don't want to say vulgar, but they may be triggering. But be mindful, the Beth B Shift is about shared lived experiences and things that affect us in a space that we probably don't recognize right away. So if any of the words that I use here today resonate with you and trigger you to some degree, take a deep breath, step back, and if necessary, get the support that you deserve. So back to the survival. What if everything you've been criticizing yourself for, like the silence, the procrastination, the inability to leave, the people pleasing, the emotional shutdown, it was never weakness, it was survival. And I feel like we think survival is an action, right? Because it always has to be accompanied by something that we're doing to kind of defend what's happening to us. And when we hear the word survival, we picture someone climbing out of a burning building or someone fighting their way out of danger or someone escaping. But our nervous system only knows how to fight. And in some cases, it only knows how to freeze, how to stay quiet, how to disappear. Sometimes survival is becoming invisible because invisible people don't get hurt. Sometimes survival is agreeing with what everyone says, right? Because disagreement once came with consequences. But before we get into that, I want to share this story. There was a time in my life when I didn't realize that all I could do was freeze. I was moving into a new space. And I called my person at that time. Well, my person called me at that time and said, "Hey, I'm leaving to go grab some stuff from the old place to bring it here." And once the phone call ended, I assumed the house was empty. And it was. But I heard a noise on the first floor. And at the time, the house was hollow, right? There was nothing in it. There was nothing in it. So there was no surround. There was no surround sound. There was nothing to protect any noises. I could hear everything. I heard something hit the floor. And I assumed that my person at that time had come back to the house. So I called downstairs. "Hey, is that you?" and there was no response. So I used my cell phone to call to ask, hey, did you come back to the house? And I was told, no, I'm not there yet. And in that moment, I shrunk myself. I shrunk myself. I turned out the lights. I closed my eyes because I didn't want my eyes to be the first thing to connect me to any person that came up the steps. I wanted everything to be dark. And I moved into the darkness. And I stood there panting and breathing as slowly as I possibly could. I tried in every instinct to avoid breathing as hard as I wanted to breathe so I wouldn't be heard, just in case someone came up the stairs. I shrunk myself. I froze in that moment. It was fright or flight, and I chose fright in that moment. And sometimes that's what happens. Sometimes that's what we go through. Sometimes we respond to things just like that. Sometimes, like I said, sometimes survival means, agreeing with everyone because disagreement comes at a consequence. And somewhere along the lines, we learn that we're not feeling safe. But none of that is character, right? None of that is character. It's programming. And one of the biggest realizations in my life was understanding that when I did, when I was exposed to domestic violence, I didn't realize at the time that I was learning survival. Because at the time I was exposed to domestic violence long before I understood what it was. And as a child, you can't stop it. As a child, you can't leave. You can't fix it. So my brain did exactly what God designed it to do, and that was adapt. And from that space, I learned to watch people's moods. I learned to predict conflict. I learned to stay quiet. I learned to read the room before speaking. I learned that safety depended on paying attention to everyone else. And the problem wasn't those skills that I had developed. The problem is they have followed me into adulthood. And in adulthood, dangers change. But, you know, my programming didn't. I didn't mature with the programming. When you're in a space as a child and you see things that you cannot control, you see things that happen that you cannot speak about, you see things that you do not understand, especially when it comes to domestic violence. If you're a kid and your discipline is a spanking, sometimes you don't have the capacity to ask, what's the difference between a spanking and abuse? Sometimes you see it and you say to yourself, we both got a spanking. It's not until, law enforcement shows up at your house and you realize something bad happened. And the invisible programming is like, have you ever noticed a person who apologizes for everything? Have you ever noticed some people can't make decisions? And when I say that, I mean, like, Have you ever spoken to someone and you ask them, like, for instance, do you want a hot dog or a hamburger? And I know this analogy may seem simple, but hear me out. If I'm asking you if you want a hot dog and a hamburger, the instantaneous thing is to think about which one you liked best, because that favoritism is attached to your taste buds, it's attached to the thoughts. You find the memory that tells you which one you like better when you experience one or the other. And then if you want ketchup or whatever condiment you want, those are decisions that we make based on how we feel, what we've experienced, and what we decided that we liked. Some of us can't do that. Some of us can't make the simplest decisions because we weren't allowed to. And, when we're in that space as a child, we become adults. And sometimes the inability to make a decision as a child follows you into adulthood. And sometimes we stay in unhealthy relationships long after we know we should leave. And some of us never ask for help. Some of us are constantly overworked. We develop like random personality traits. And many of those personality traits start as survival strategies. And that strategy wasn't wrong. Like it wasn't meant to become your identity. It wasn't meant to to determine who we are as people. That wasn't the case. And the problem with that is like staying in survival mode. The hardest thing about doing that is that it works. Sometimes it works. And that's where we learn to develop. And this is why it becomes difficult for us to let go. Think about it. If staying quiet protected you, then you stay quiet. If pleasing people protected you, then you keep pleasing people. If becoming emotionally unavailable kept you from getting hurt, then you keep everybody at a distance. Eventually, though, the thing that once protected you starts imprisoning you. It starts to keep you trapped. And in that space, we learn to survive. We learn to stay there unscathed. We learn to stay there without an issue. We develop a way to stay there without being hurt. And if you ever really experience that moment, and it doesn't have to be domestic violence, it could be anything that startled you in the moment. But when you're exposed to those behaviors, you learn to look at the person who's being attacked. You notice that their mannerisms change. They don't speak up for themselves the way they used to. They don't laugh at the highest pitch when they want to express happiness. They don't go places that they used to enjoy that once made them happy. They don't wear clothes, or they don't work like they want to. They try to stay within in a space that won't cause the other person to react. The other person, that other person, that the attacker, you start to notice their mannerisms. You start to notice what makes them tick. You start to notice how sensitive they are, and words that trigger them, that force them to respond in a certain way, that makes them go from 0 to 100 real quick. And then when you are exposed to that response, and that response is accompanied by physical situations, you start to learn to read that. You start to learn to read what triggers them. And you learn vicariously what not to do. And that's not the only place that you display though that response. That's not the only place that you figure it out and you respond in that same way. And I didn't realize that was happening to me until I was long gone from the situation where I was exposed to domestic violence. But because I had already had the ear that was trained to listen to a different pitch and voice, I had the eyes that were trained to look and see and observe the behaviors that are brewing and about to change for the worse. I was trained for sarcasm and cynical responses. And I was trained to understand what silence meant from that same person with those responses. And when you are exposed to that, sometimes when you can't respond, when you can't retaliate, you can't protect yourself physically, or you can't protect the person that you're witnessing who is being attacked, you freeze. You don't say much. You don't do much. You learn to shrink yourself. You learn to stay quiet. You learn to be reserved. You learn to think, yeah, I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to do that. And that question is a question that I'm not going to respond to because I know what it can bring. And that can happen in any space in your life. Maybe you are working somewhere and your boss changes tones. Their words become a little more aggressive, or they're cynical, they're sarcastic. And you know if you respond, it may not be a physical response, but you know that there's a retaliation that's underway because you know that behavior. You know that pattern. You know what it looks like. You've seen it. You've had the opportunity to study it. You know what it feels like. You know that emptiness, that distance that's created between you and the person that's about to pop off. That awkward air of silence that happens just before the other person's mood changes, that changes the entire situation in that moment forever. But when we recognize those spaces, right, when we see that that's what's happening, we understand what's going on, we get it, right? We get it. And now we're molded, we're conditioned, we're programmed to respond to the different voice. Maybe you're in a relationship or a marriage with someone who sends their voice up an octave or two. You start looking out for, uh-oh, things are about to change. But what I did realize, and I understood, that healing didn't begin when my circumstances changed. Healing began when I recognized the patterns. And once I was able to name it, I could challenge it. And instead of asking, what's wrong with me? I started asking, what happened that taught me this? And that question changed everything. Because shame sometimes says, I'm the problem. right? And that's often the immediate go-to. I'm the problem. But healing says, I learned this and I can learn something different. Sometimes when we are in that situation, we're in that space and we don't realize that we've been programmed or conditioned to stay and accept a pattern or behavior that is unhealthy for us. We don't realize at that moment that we can actually learn something different. We can be unprogrammed, right? And reprogrammed. We don't see that right away. We don't notice that right away. We don't accept it right away. We don't accept that at all right away. Because the initial thing is, I can't do anything about this. I can't make the change. I can't change that person. So if that person is going to be that way all the time, what can I do? Which is nothing in the moment, which programs us to feel like we're always helpless. But here's the shift. I think one of the greatest acts for self-compassion is recognizing that your younger self did exactly what they needed to do to survive. And they deserve gratitude, not criticism. And your adult self deserves more than survival. Like, healing starts that process. We deserve healthy relationships. We deserve to rest without guilt, resting without guilt, thinking back to the things that you witnessed, thinking back to the things you were exposed to, thinking back to what you thought you should have done, thinking back and watching when we're exposed to TV shows that show us how survivors act on TV, listening to other conversations where other people have experienced the same thing. Their development may be different from ours. And just because we didn't choose to fight at that moment doesn't make us a bad person. And sometimes when we feel like we should have done something more, we live with the guilt as adults. But I want to remind you that you deserve joy without waiting for permission. You don't need anybody to tell you to be happy. The shift. Stop asking why you still struggle. Ask yourself what you struggle with once protection, once you started to protect yourself, once you realize what protection actually was. Because once you understand the purpose of the behavior, you no longer hate yourself for having it. You don't hate yourself for having it. And you can think it, and you can release it. You can be in a space where you realize at that moment, I could not have done anything as a child. Some of us don't even know how to contact 911. Some of us have no clue that what we experience is something wrong. Some of us don't realize it until we become adults and we see our own patterns and behaviors and how we conduct ourselves, how we respond to things that we are afraid of, how we respond to a person's voice who elevates and escalates, how we respond to blurred eyes, how we respond to shifted faces, how we respond to hand movements. And as adults, we can see the interaction with another person that forces us to respond, if not the same way, in the opposed way. And when we question that, we don't get it right away. Sometimes we have to have several experiences in life where we do take a stand at some point. Our initial response to some things we experience as adults doesn't always pan out the way we choose. But that response as a child is something that we cannot feel guilty about. It's not up to us as children to protect another adult. And that guilt can live with us for a while. It can make us think that we didn't do enough, we didn't care enough, we didn't love enough. And once that creeps into adulthood, we gotta recognize the patterns and behaviors of the people who were committing the acts and know that in that space there was nothing we could do. The best thing though is learning as an adult how that made you feel, remembering only for the purpose of healing, right? We don't want to remember to stay in the guilt. We don't want to remember to stay in a moment where we feel like, oh my God, that happened because of me. I could have helped that other person. I could have told someone. I could have said something. I could have stood guard. Maybe if I didn't say anything, maybe if I didn't breathe, right? But that's not up to us. It's not for us to manage. It's not for us to manage. Domestic violence will always be a serious situation. It will always be a thing that we need to bring awareness to so people who are experiencing it know that they have options, know that there's an alternative. And it's not always easy for the person who is in the situation to make that decision. It's not always easy for them to do that. There are reasons that those people stay, but the inner child in us, the person in us, the 8-year-old version of us who saw it, the 8-year-old or 5-year-old version of us that knew that there was some rumblings in a space, the 8-year-old or 5-year-old version of us that feels like, what happened? There was never an explanation for what happened. Why did these adults do what they did? Why did I have to see this? Why is this the behavior that I'm exposed to? We can always ask that question. But as adults, we have the opportunity to affect change in our own lives. We have the right to forgive ourselves. We have the right to give ourselves grace and permission to live beyond what it is that we've been exposed to. We can settle with one thought at a time. This was not my fault. And there's nothing I could have done to change it. Once we see that that is how we should conclude and heal from that space, we become better versions of ourselves. And if today's conversation resonated you, I want you to remember this. Like, remember, survival got you here. But healing will take you where you're meant to go. You don't have to shame the person who survived. Like, sometimes that's not a conversation that we want to have with the person that we saw in that situation. Sometimes that's not our space. That's not up to us. That's not for us to handle. Just don't ask them to lead the rest of your life. Don't allow that incident to dictate your happiness for the rest of your life. There's a process. There's a process that we all have to go through, a healing process, and there's steps to that. But the first step to healing is identifying what it is that happened, understanding what our role and responsibility was in that setting. And as a child, there was nothing. Now, I'm not talking about adults who are in the situation. There's a process for that too. I'm speaking to the inner child. I'm speaking to the person who is still carrying the guilt about what they didn't do to protect the person that they saw in that situation. I'm speaking to the person who is now possibly in the situation themselves and they're allowing it to happen because that's the way they think life is. They think that's the way life should be. They think that's okay. They don't realize that it's dysfunction and that there's an alternative. The inner child has to be healed first. And the adult who's carrying the weight of that inner child has some homework to do. We can heal from this space. We can become a better version of ourselves. We can forgive ourselves for the things that we were never responsible for in the first place. That's the shift. Understanding that it was never your responsibility in the first place. And learning how to respond to those very things that we may experience in life can be managed by us right now. Seeing it, feeling it, remembering it, but realizing we don't get to carry that guilt for the rest of our lives. We can affect change right now. Sometimes we don't know the steps. Sometimes we don't know the process. We don't know where support is for us to manage that process. Some of us don't feel like there's a process to manage, but there is. And we deserve to understand that process. We deserve to be a part of the process, and we deserve to heal from those steps. We deserve to be in a better space. We deserve to be happy. And we get to choose. We get to choose whether we stay in a space that is unhealthy. We get to choose if we stay in a space that is unhealthy. We have the right to choose. My adult life is my life. I get to choose whether I stay here or I do not. I get to choose whether this is healthy or unhealthy. I get to choose, does this make me happy or sad? I get to choose. Do I like your tone of voice or not? I get to choose. Do I like how you speak to me and the words that you choose to speak to me? I get to choose. I get to say no. It's my turn to say no. And I have the right to say no. And once we learn our right to choose, our right to say no, our right to say, I don't want that for me, to the right to say, I've heard of happier situations and this doesn't look like that. I get to choose. Choose. We get to choose. We get to choose to be happy. We get to choose not to be in dysfunction. We get to choose who we want to be today. I don't have to be the surviving child for the rest of my life. I can be the healed woman if I choose to be that person for the rest of my life. It's up to me. And there are steps that I can take to manage that process. There are things that I can do to make sure that the memories in my mind don't haunt me in the negative forever. I get to choose. It is up to me to be happy. And once I learned and discovered what happiness looked like, I started to choose. And the healing process looks so much better on the other side of the 8-year-old version of me. You get to choose. You get to choose. If this resonated with you in any way, leave it in the comments. I'm not asking you to expose yourself, but say, I get it. Because we get to choose. We don't have to wait for someone else to make us happy. No one else gets to determine whether I smile today or not. I get to choose. And so do you. This has been the Beth B Shift. And remember, once you see unhealthy behaviors, once you see unhealthy patterns, you can't unsee it. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And when you see it, you get to choose to act. And until next time, stay grounded.